Mansa Musa was the wealthiest person in recorded history, and for centuries the world assumed it understood where he came from. It did not. Genetic research into his dynastic lineage has quietly overturned assumptions that scholars, historians, and even the dynasty's own oral tradition had held for generations. What the DNA revealed is not just surprising. It exposes a contradiction at the heart of his legacy that no document ever could. And by the end, the answer will change how you see the entire empire. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. In the summer of 1324, a man crossed the Sahara Desert with an entourage so vast it reshaped the economies of every region it passed through. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, was making the Hajj to Mecca, and he brought with him between 60,000 and 80,000 people, 500 enslaved men, each carrying a golden staff, and so much gold that when he distributed it freely across Cairo, he triggered an inflation crisis that destabilized Egyptian markets for more than a decade. Arab chroniclers struggled to find adequate language for what they witnessed. Some simply recorded numbers instead. The empire that produced this man was not an accident. The Mali Empire had been built over generations through military consolidation, strategic trade positioning, and dynastic continuity stretching back nearly a century before Musa took the throne. At its peak, it covered roughly 2 million square kilometers, controlling the trans-Saharan gold and salt routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and beyond. Timbuktu became one of the wealthiest and most intellectually active cities in the medieval world. The empire was not on the periphery of medieval civilization. It was one of its centers. The dynasty behind this empire was the Keita line, whose founding mythology reaches back to Sundiata Keita, the warrior king who united the Manda-speaking peoples in the 13th century and laid the foundation on which Musa would eventually stand. Griot historians, hereditary oral scholars whose purpose was to preserve dynastic memory, maintained genealogical accounts of the Keita lineage, stretching back generations before the empire existed. Almost everything the outside world recorded about Mansa Musa was written by people who were never there, or who arrived long after the peak had passed. Ibn Battuta visited Mali in 1352, more than 20 years after Musa's death. Ibn Khaldun compiled his accounts from secondhand sources. European cartographers drew Musa's image on maps without ever setting foot in his kingdom. When the people who wrote your history were outsiders working from Reconstruction, the question of who you actually were remains genuinely open. For Mansa Musa, that question would wait 7 centuries for a credible answer. The historical record surrounding Mansa Musa is not simply incomplete. It is compromised in ways that took scholars generations to fully appreciate. Ibn Battuta, the most widely cited eyewitness source on medieval Mali, arrived in the empire in 1352, and what he recorded was a kingdom already in transition. His account was filtered through his own Islamic scholarly framework and shaped by what local informants chose to tell a foreign visitor. Ibn Khaldun, whose accounts remain foundational to Malian historiography, compiled his work entirely from secondhand testimony. Neither man witnessed Musa's reign directly, yet for centuries their accounts formed the backbone of everything the outside world believed about him. The griot tradition offered an alternative, but not a simple one. Hereditary oral historians preserve genealogical records with remarkable consistency across generations, but their accounts were never politically neutral. Griots served the dynasty. Their role was to preserve legitimacy, not just memory. When genealogical details supported royal authority, they were transmitted faithfully. When they complicated that authority, the record became more flexible. Different griot lineages preserved different versions of the same dynastic history, and the divergences were not minor. The most significant dispute centered on the origins of the Keita line itself. Some accounts describe the dynasty as purely indigenous, rooted in the Manda-speaking heartland of the upper Niger River basin for as far back as memory reached. Others introduced an external connection, tracing Keita ancestry to Bilal ibn Rabah, the Ethiopian-born companion of the Prophet Muhammad and one of the most revered figures in early Islamic history. This claim placed the dynasty's bloodline within the founding generation of Islam itself. The Bilal origin story was not a minor footnote. It appeared across multiple griot lineages and was used actively to legitimize Malian Islamic rule across the Saharan world, but it also raised a question no document could answer. Was it history, or was it politics dressed as history? For centuries, that question had no mechanism for resolution. Then science offered one. By the early 2000s, population genetics had advanced to a point where questions that documents could not settle were becoming answerable through a different kind of record entirely. The human genome, passed down through generations with far less distortion than oral tradition or colonial historiography, had become a legitimate tool for historical investigation. Researchers studying West African population structures began asking questions that no archive could address. Where did these peoples come from? How long had they been here? And what did their genetic signatures reveal about the empires they built? The Keita surname became a specific subject of interest, not simply as a royal name, but as a potential marker of shared paternal descent across a population that had carried it for centuries. If living Keita men and populations connected to the historical Manda-speaking core of the Mali Empire could be tested, their Y chromosome data might reach back far enough to illuminate the dynasty's true origins. One camp held that the Keita line was purely indigenous, an expression of the ancient Niger-Congo agricultural populations that had inhabited the upper Niger River basin for millennia. Their argument rested on linguistic continuity, archaeological evidence of settled farming communities predating the empire, and the internal logic of the griot genealogies that made no credible reference to outside paternal origins before the Bilal claim was introduced. The opposing position was less unified, but equally persistent. Some scholars pointed to the speed and depth of Islamic conversion within the dynasty as evidence of genuine Arabian cultural and possibly biological connection. Others noted that the trans-Saharan trade networks that made the empire wealthy also created sustained contact with North African Berber and Arab populations over centuries. Contact, they argued, left genetic traces. The question was how deep those traces ran and whether they reached the royal line itself. Neither camp had genetic evidence. Both were working from inference, analogy, and the selective use of sources that already supported their conclusions. The DNA studies would not simply confirm one side, they would complicate both. When researchers began sequencing Y chromosome data from Keita surname carriers and broader Manda-speaking populations across West Africa, the results started forming a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The paternal signal running through these populations was not mixed or ambiguous. It was ancient, concentrated, and pointed in a single direction. The dominant haplogroup identified across the core Manda-speaking populations was E1B1A, a paternal lineage whose origins trace back to the Lake Chad Basin region somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. This was not a recent signal. It was not the product of medieval trade contact or religious conversion. It was among the oldest continuous paternal lineages identified anywhere in West Africa, connected to the early expansion of Niger-Congo agricultural peoples who spread westward across the savannah long before any empire rose to organize them. What made this finding significant was not just its age, it was its specificity. The E1B1A subclades identified in Keita-connected populations were not scattered randomly across a broad geographic range. They clustered with remarkable consistency in the upper Niger River basin, precisely the region the griot tradition had always identified as the Keita heartland. The genetic geography matched the oral geography in a way that was difficult to attribute to coincidence. For the scholars who had argued the dynasty's roots were purely indigenous, this was confirmation. The paternal line had not arrived from Arabia or North Africa. It had not been imported through trade networks or religious contact. It had been there in that specific region for thousands of years before Sundiata Keita united the Mandi-speaking peoples. and before Mansa Musa made the world take notice. The colonial era theories that had credited external influence for the sophistication of the Mali Empire were not just unsupported by this data, they were contradicted by it. But the Y chromosome only tells half the story. It traces the father's line, and the father's line alone. The maternal side of the dynasty's ancestry had not yet been examined with the same precision. And when it was, the picture became considerably more complicated. The maternal line told a different story, and it told it carefully. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of populations connected to the medieval Mali Empire's core ethnic groups revealed a maternal picture that was older and deeper than even the paternal findings had suggested. The dominant signals running through Manda-speaking and Soninke populations belonged to haplogroup L subclades, ancient West African maternal lineages whose roots stretch back tens of thousands of years. These were not migration signals. They were residency signals. The maternal line of the populations that built the Mali Empire had been in West Africa longer than almost any comparable lineage anywhere on Earth. But that was not the complete picture. Within certain populations historically connected to trans-Saharan trade networks and high-status lineages, researchers detected something unexpected. Traces of haplogroup M and haplogroup U subclades appeared, markers more commonly associated with North African and Near Eastern maternal origins. These signals were not dominant. In most tested populations, they represented a small fraction of the overall maternal profile, but their presence was statistically notable, and more importantly, their distribution was not random. The M and U traces clustered in populations with documented historical connections to the trans-Saharan trade corridors. They appeared at higher frequencies in lineages associated with merchant classes and royal networks than in more isolated interior populations. This was not background noise. It was a pattern, and patterns in population genetics have causes. The most coherent explanation was also the most historically logical. Centuries of trans-Saharan trade had created sustained, intimate contact between West African noble and merchant families and North African or Arab trading partners. Islam, adopted as the dynastic religion of the Qaeda line, deepened those connections further. Intermarriage between Malian elite families and traders or scholars from across the Sahara was not just possible. Given the historical record of sustained contact, it was probable. This did not redefine Mansa Musa's ancestry. The West African maternal foundation was overwhelming and ancient, but it added layers the oral tradition had never acknowledged and the documentary record had never captured. The empire, it turned out, had always been more connected than its mythology admitted. The Bilal origin story had survived for centuries because it served a purpose. It connected the Qaeda dynasty to the founding generation of Islam, lending the empire a spiritual legitimacy that extended far beyond the borders of West Africa. For a ruler like Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca was as much a political statement as a religious one, that connection was invaluable. The claim was preserved across multiple griot lineages, repeated in Islamic scholarly literature, and accepted without serious challenge for generations. The Y chromosome data challenged it directly. Haplogroup J, the paternal marker most strongly associated with Arabian and Near Eastern male descent, was completely absent from the core Qaeda lineage data. If the Qaeda patrilineal line had genuinely descended from Bilal ibn Rabah, an Ethiopian-born man who lived in 7th century Arabia, some trace of that Near Eastern or East African high admixture paternal signal would be expected in the genetic record. That signal was not found. What this did not mean was that the griots had lied. It meant that the Bilal claim functioned the way origin myths function in every civilization that has ever used them. It was a legitimizing narrative, constructed or adopted at the moment when connecting the dynasty to Islamic authority became politically essential. The Mali Empire's conversion to Islam was not simply a spiritual transformation, it was a strategic repositioning within a vast network of trade, scholarship, and political alliance. An origin story that placed the royal bloodline beside the prophet's closest companion was central to that repositioning. Stripping away the mythology does not diminish the dynasty, it clarifies it. The Keita line did not need a borrowed ancestry to justify its achievements. It had built one of the largest and wealthiest empires in human history on a foundation that the genetic record now confirmed was among the oldest in the region. But the confirmation also sharpened a question the DNA had not yet answered. If the Bilal lineage was mythology and the indigenous West African roots were confirmed, what exactly did the admixture signals in the maternal line represent? Whose names had history failed to record? Genome-wide admixture studies of modern populations across Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and the Gambia produced something more than individual ancestry results. They produced a map. The ancestral pattern that emerged was consistent across a broad geographic range. Overwhelmingly, West African at its foundation, with variable but measurable signals of North African and Near Eastern ancestry appearing in specific populations rather than uniformly across the region. The distribution was not random, and that pattern of non-randomness was the finding that carried the most historical weight. The admixture signals clustered along corridors. The Timbuktu region, the upper Niger River basin, the old trans-Saharan trade routes that had moved bound salt and scholarship between West Africa and the Mediterranean world for centuries. Populations living near these historical contact points showed higher rates of North African and Near Eastern admixture than populations in more isolated interior regions. The genetic map and the historical map were telling the same story. What this confirmed was that the Mali Empire's external connections were not superficial. They were deep enough and sustained enough to leave a measurable biological record across generations. The scholars who traveled to Timbuktu, the traders who crossed the Sahara, the diplomatic and religious contacts that Mansa Musa's pilgrimage both expressed and expanded. These relationships produced not just cultural exchange, but genetic exchange. The empire absorbed outside influence the way it absorbed outside wealth, selectively, strategically, and without surrendering its core identity. The colonial era narrative that had cast African empires as isolated, static, or dependent on external sophistication was not just contradicted by the historical record, it was contradicted by the genome itself. The Mali Empire showed up in the DNA of its descendants as exactly what the best historical scholarship had always argued it was: a civilization that engaged the wider world from a position of power, not dependency. That reframing matters beyond academic debate. It changes the terms on which the empire is understood, not as a peripheral beneficiary of outside contact, but as an active center that drew the world toward it and left a biological record of that gravitational pull. The evidence was now substantial, but one question remained untouched. The one question the genetic evidence could not answer was also the most personal. Despite everything the research revealed about population structure, haplogroup distribution, and admixture patterns across the Mali Empire's core territories, no verified direct line male descendant of Mansa Musa himself had been identified and tested. The Y chromosome findings describe the genetic world he came from with considerable precision, but they did not confirm his personal paternal haplogroup. That remains inferred, not established. Probability is built on population data rather than a direct line of descent. The same limitation applied to the maternal side. The mitochondrial signals identified in Mandi speaking and high-status lineage populations gave researchers a credible picture of the maternal genetic environment surrounding the Keita dynasty. But no verified matrilineal descendant of Musa's own line had been traced and confirmed. The man at the center of the investigation remained just beyond the reach of direct genetic identification. This is not a failure of the science. It is a reflection of who history chose to record and who it did not. Mansa Musa's personal life, his mother's, his wives, his children beyond the dynastic record were almost entirely undocumented, even by those who witnessed his power firsthand. The Arab chroniclers who described his pilgrimage recorded his gold and his generosity, but they did not record his lineage in the detail that genetic research would one day require. What science confirmed was the world that made him. It showed an ancient, deeply rooted West African paternal foundation stretching back thousands of years before the empire rose. It showed a maternal layer, reflecting centuries of trans-Saharan contact that the official story had never acknowledged. The indigenous core was so established and so continuous that the colonial narratives built to obscure it could not survive contact with the data. The man who crossed the Sahara in 1324 and bent the economies of 3 continents with a single journey did not come from borrowed greatness. He came from one of the oldest, most continuously inhabited lineages in human history. The record simply forgot to mention it. The genome did not. What the DNA confirmed is both simpler and more profound than the myth. Mansa Musa's patrilineal roots were ancient, indigenous, and unbroken, stretching back thousands of years into the West African heartland that produced him. The admixture layers only add complexity to a story that was never simple. One question remains: the specific individuals whose unions left those outside signals in the genome have no names in any record. History documented the empire. It did not document everyone who built it.